Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and doing well in these times. And we're sorry we weren't able to do this in person, but we hope that this will be an interesting way to interact. And we're really glad to be able to convene the community and have this discussion. And we're interested to hear folks' thoughts. So Heather, I think I'm going to hand it over to you now to get started. So welcome, everyone.
Okay, yes, thank you everyone for coming to Rising to Resilience Challenges. As some of you may know, we had originally scheduled a very large-scale research showcase for today. So we're translating it to a different format that we're actually quite excited about. And rather than having something be lost in translation, we're actually hoping that this can be a chance that we can reach and bring even more of you into the conversation about resilience, past, present, and future, and in Texas, but also beyond. I'm keeping my remarks really brief since we're on a shortened time frame here. But I'd be glad to, and I know Jenny, who was just speaking, Jenny Gray, the program director for Planet Texas, we'd be very glad to share more information about what we've accomplished in this fiscal year through our annual reports and mid-year reports. So I won't be going into all of that because only have a couple minutes before I turn it over to our speakers. But we have certainly been expanding the number of projects, the number of UT and community groups who are involved in our work. We've been defining our values of resilience, equity, and interdisciplinarity. We've made great strides on our data and modeling platforms that are now doing test runs. We have a number of accomplishments we would love to talk to you about, but are going to actually give more space to our speakers today. So I just wanted to welcome all of the current researchers in Planet Texas 2050 projects, but also we're really pleased to have many of our partners from beyond the university and also having parties here who are just interested to learn more about the work of Planet Texas. So thank you all. I'm sure we all share in this vision of having a more resilient Texas. If not before now, certainly now that we are all finding modes of resilience and helping others with that too under the COVID-19 lockdown. So Jenny, do you want to go to the agenda? So here's our agenda. I am speaking now. I will turn it over to Adam Rabinowitz in a moment. And then we have Patrick Bixler and Carmen Yanez Polito, and finally Suzanne Pierce. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A and discussion. Just very quickly, the next slide, Jenny. We have these rules of the game now that we're in this format of Zoom. So I would just ask you to look these over now. Certainly mute yourself. I'm sure folks know this by now. But just wanted to underscore that when we get to the Q&A, please use that raise hand function that you can find by, at least one way to do it is to go down to participants and find your name in there, and you can find various actions at that point. So take a look at these, and we will then move into the presentations. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our speakers. So we'll begin with Adam Rabinowitz.
Hi, everybody. I should begin by saying this is my first Zoom presentation, so bear with me. I think it'll work okay. I'm Adam Rabinowitz. I am an associate professor in the classics department and a member of the theme organizing committee for the Planet Texas 2050 Bridging Barriers project. I am a field archaeologist. That is, I work on the material remains of the past, specifically in Greek and Roman antiquity. And I am also interested in long-term historical and social phenomena related to how communities get along with each other, and trying to find ways to explore that through looking at what we left behind after us. And I'm not a specialist in the history of medicine. I'm not a specialist in plague or pandemic, But I want to outline a couple of ways in which I think that looking at the past and its longer term developments and looking at ourselves, looking at the past, can help us to understand resilience in the context of pandemic and the sort of situation that we find ourselves in both expectedly and unexpectedly today. Jenny, could I have the next slide, please? So in the pre-modern period, before germ theory, when a massive plague broke out and mortality was really high, and people didn't have much explanation for what was going on other than that sick people made other people sick, one frequent response was to assume that this is the end of the world. This is a divine punishment and we're all going to die. That's a non-resilient outcome, right? A species goes extinct. But I have a happy spoiler, which is that we didn't all die in any of these events because we're all still here as human beings. So on that very baseline level, the human species is resilient to plague because we have survived it. But that idea that it is the end of the world is a good starting point for understanding some of the differences between the past and the present and understanding what we mean when we talk about resilience, because I'm pretty sure that a definition that is just we all managed to survive as a race is not going to feel sufficient for our society and for us as individuals. Could I have the next slide, please? So I wanted to talk a bit about what we mean by resilience on a couple of different levels before I get into what the past has to contribute, because the definition is going to be important for our understanding of what the past can tell us. So when we talk about resilience on an ecological level, it's the ability of a system to come back to more or less the same state as it was before a shock. And the more rapidly and smoothly a system can do that, the more resilient we consider it to be. We've applied this term also to individuals on a psychological level. So resilience is the ability to come back to a state of full mental health, previous mental health after experiencing a trauma. We're going to talk about it a lot today in terms of communities being resilient. That is coming back to the functioning that they had before with more or less the same components, the same inputs and outputs. And on a systemic level, we're also going to talk about institutional resilience. And this is, I think, something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, the bigger picture. How resilient are our systems of government, our systems of international relationships and trade? And again, the general assumption, if not the expressed one, is that resilience means getting back to business as normal as fast as possible. And we see this playing out in our current discourse about reopening the economy under the conditions of the current pandemic. So I'd like to leave that on the table, whether what we're talking about in terms of resilience is getting back to business as usual as it was before the shock, and whether that applies when we look at the past. Could I have the next slide, please, Jenny? Yeah, there we go. So I don't know if everybody has noticed, but the past has come up fairly frequently in its most simple forms in a lot of venues, a lot of journalistic venues in the last month. And the focus has been on a couple of things: the most famous pandemics of antiquity and the Middle Ages. The earliest one being the pandemic described by the Greek author Thucydides, which happened in Athens in 430 BC. And the most famous of which is the Black Death outbreak in the 14th century AD. And there are two ways of looking at this. One is from the perspective of the narratives themselves. And this has to do with the resilience, I suppose, of those narratives on a psychological level. The ancient and medieval authors all focus on the breakdown of social rules in the context of pandemic outbreak. So the narrative there is that when the constraints and the sense of general security that any individual experiences break down, what you have is people behaving as amoral monsters, as animals, throwing bodies out in the street, leaving other people to suffer, running away from their own family so as not to get sick themselves. That's the narrative of Thucydides' plague in his History of the Peloponnesian War. It's the narrative of a number of the chroniclers like Ditura in the description of the Black Death. And it's a narrative that I think has been picked up in terms of fear, that pandemics reveal our basest instincts. And I think you can see that to a certain extent in both popular media now. So the movie Contagion turns pretty quickly to looting and rioting and martial law. And also even in the reaction to the COVID pandemic, which seems to be a lot less fatal than either Thucydides' plague or the plague described in Contagion, where tons of people went out and immediately bought guns as their response. So guns and toilet paper, presumably out of a fear that they would need those guns to defend the toilet paper that they had been hoarding. On the other hand, there is a persistent and resilient narrative that says that pandemics restructure society in such a way that there is at least a period of greater creativity and equity. So Walter Scheidel, historian at Stanford, has argued that only war and pandemic are likely to create any kind of income leveling. And there's a longstanding trope about the Black Death that it gave way to the Renaissance by increasing labor prices among the remaining surviving members of the laboring class and facilitating the rise of non-elites because they now had access to more stuff because there were fewer people. So these are two different narratives, one positive, one negative, that we continue to repeat about the past. But if you look carefully at the current environment, you'll also see that a bunch of historians are critiquing the idea that we can just use the past to mirror the present. That if Thucydides says that Athens breaks down and everybody is horrible to each other, that we are likely to break down and be horrible to each other. And those historians have pointed out that, one, the context is very different right now. That is, we have more than 1 billion people on the Earth's surface under some form of organized lockdown, which would have been impossible at any point before the information age. We have the internet. We have ways of keeping up with what's going on an hourly basis. And also, the actual events bear out a much more positive view of society. We haven't all started shooting at each other over toilet paper hoards. People are still helping each other out. So here's the question: can we actually do anything with information from the past, other than pursue narratives that people are terrible or people are good, or if there are fewer people, things are better, which are the simplified narratives that we tend to get? Can I have the next slide, Jenny? So I've been approaching this from the perspective of archaeology. And archaeology is good for this in the sense that it is good at looking for long-term systemic changes. You can see breakdown happening over a period of centuries because we have centuries worth of data. And it also gives you windows into the lives of individuals, like this reconstructed 11-year-old from one of the burials associated with that Athenian plague in 430. So we can get very detailed or we can get very broad. But what we're missing is a way to explore and understand resilience on a community level, on the sort of meso scale of larger groups of people, but not entire systems. And this is something that I find particularly interesting. So how do you understand a city or a community as being resilient in the face of a pandemic, as opposed to an individual's life and life experiences as inscribed on their bones, or to localized archaeological phenomena like disordered burial rituals? So when people start burying people in pits because they have to do it fast, you can see that there's a stress and a trauma, but it's harder to project what that means for community and community resilience. Next slide, please. So one way that the Planet Texas research teams have been trying to look at some of these issues, not specifically related to pandemics, but with implications for pandemics, is by looking at human mobility. And this is a common feature of all pandemics. For things to be pandemic, to spread across the world, they have to be carried by people or animals or fleas or things that people are carrying. And so you can see that as we try to understand what's going on with COVID-19, we are creating networks and trying to trace where people have been and where they've gone. We have an incredibly connected world, rapidly connected by air travel and by a fairly porous set of borders, but we tend to forget that the ancient world and the medieval world were also really deeply connected. Maybe a little bit slower by sea travel, but if you look at the network map of places that were affected by the Black Death, there is a clear pathway for a disease to move rapidly from the Central Asian steppes to the furthest parts of England. Next slide, please. So here's one of the differences. In the modern state, we have really good ways of tracking that kind of movement. So cell phone data, for example, there was a video that went around created by a company called Tectonics, which was a map of the cell phone location data for a group of people who were at the same Florida beach during spring break. And what you see here is a screen grab after they've left that beach, and the same phones were traced to the places where they ended up. And you can see that the entire eastern half of the United States is covered by the people who were at that beach together during spring break. So this raises two issues. One, we obviously have a much richer data set to understand movement. Two, we have a surveillance state. And the question of resilience comes up there. That is, if this surveillance state makes us more resilient to these challenges because we can track people, is it desirable? Or does the presence of a surveillance state make us less resilient in other ways? But we do have ways of tracking the movement of people in the past on the basis of the isotopic residue of their bones. And I'm showing here an isotopic map of the strontium landscape of France, not because Planet Texas works in France. We've been concentrating this work in Mesoamerica, Belize and Guatemala, and in Romania at the site that you see behind me, and Serbia along the Roman imperial border of the Danube. But this is a good example of how isotopic differences within a landscape can be used to trace the movement of individuals. And there's a link below, which I can share with anybody who's interested, to an article that attempts to understand how the movement of people after plagues, people coming into communities that had been decimated by plague in the 15th and 16th century, then aided or was problematic for the recovery of those cities on an economic basis. Next slide, please. The other thing that we can talk about when we talk about movement is genetics. So another tool that we have at our disposal, and that is comparable between the ancient and the modern world, is looking at the evolutionary change of viruses and bacteria as they move through human host populations. So you're looking at two phylogenetic trees, and probably many of us have become familiar with phylogenetic trees in the last month or so, which show the splitting by mutation of strains above of the bacterium that causes the Black Death and below of the COVID-19 virus. And you can map those onto landscapes and see how those viruses are moving around, being carried by people. So they are a proxy for human movement, and they are also a proxy for time because the mutations occur at predictable rates. And this particular graph of the COVID virus was one way that we could say it didn't all come directly to the US from China. And in fact, the strain that you see at the top above the green and yellow was coming to us from Europe, from people who had come from China to Europe. So phylogenetic analysis of ancient disease can help us understand how those diseases move through and with human populations, and then help inform the modeling of the phylogenetic transformation and spread of current pandemics. So these set us up to think about how we can understand what a disease is doing. But it doesn't necessarily set us up to understand how resilience is working. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is where things get a little bit trickier for those of us who work on the past in a context of a project like Planet Texas 2050, where we are really trying to make Texas more resilient, able to recover from shocks like the one that we're experiencing. But here's the thing. We know we're able to recover from shocks like the one that we're experiencing. And we know that we are able to deal with trauma. And in that sense, we're already resilient. And we have narratives that help us frame this. And you can see what I've put in here are a photo of the 1918 influenza epidemic and burial trenches, a photo of burial trenches from the movie Contagion, and a photo of the burial trenches on Hart Island in New York, where they're storing the excess bodies that they can't deal with right now. This is a visual icon for us. We understand what it means. We can repeat it in movies. And although it symbolizes trauma, it also gives us a sense that we are going to get through this on the other end because we have before. So the question for me at this point is, if we can understand how diseases are working in past societies, and that helps us understand their effects, we have to define resilience before we can understand what that means for resilience. And I proposed at the beginning that we're talking about resilience as business as usual, but I'm not sure that given the cracks in our own social fabric that this pandemic has exposed, we really mean that. That is, maybe we should be thinking about resilience as creating better systems on the other side of what we're experiencing now, rather than going back to the system that we had. So I put this out there, and I think that the other discussions will probably address this as well. In the past, resilience meant you survived and your system was either more or less the same. So Italy kept on trucking and went to the Renaissance after the Black Plague, or your system disappears entirely. After the pandemics that affected the New World, for example, most of the indigenous systems were either completely disrupted and had to reform or disappeared. But I think we should be looking for something between those two extremes and thinking about remaking systems as well as rebuilding systems. Thanks. I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. That was a really great presentation and really connects to the present state quite well, and some of the key points that I hope to convey during this section. So I'm Patrick Fixler. I'm based at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and I'm a core faculty member of the Texas Metropolitan Observatory Project of Planet Texas 2050. The Texas Metro Observatory is a data and communications platform that tracks trends across the metropolitan areas of Texas. We look at the 25 metropolitan statistical areas in the state. And some of the work that we've been doing through Texas, through the TMO, is working to try to understand the present state. So can we understand the demographic trends, the economic trends of our state, of our metropolitan areas across the state. Next slide, please. Part of what we've been working to better understand is urban resilience. Urban resilience takes the same frame that Adam presented, that the definition, and what we're really trying to understand is how cities survive, how cities can thrive, and how they can bounce forward. This speaks to that the transformation piece that Adam was talking about. So how can we transform in the face of shocks or stressors? For Texas, we typically are thinking about a certain set of hazards, such as floods, wildfire, urban heat, hurricanes, and other climate-related hazards. Or at least 6 months ago, when we started setting up this framework and thinking about urban resilience, we were focused on climate-related hazards. So we weren't necessarily thinking about pandemics when we built our framework, but the current COVID crisis is a perfect case for us to think about the relationship between resilience and vulnerability in urban areas. Next slide, please. So one of the projects that we've taken on is to map social vulnerability across the state of Texas. So social vulnerability is a percentile-based measure of susceptibility to disasters. It basically integrates 6 components of social, economic, race, ethnicity, age, gender, and housing variables. And as you can see, social vulnerability is not equally distributed across the state. We have certain regions, certain cities, certain metropolitan areas with much higher levels of vulnerable populations that put them at risk if and when a hazard strikes, puts them at extra risk in terms of a pandemic spreading across the state. Next slide, please. And so as we see social vulnerability not equally distributed across the state of Texas, we can also see it not equally distributed across or within a metropolitan area. So for example, in Austin, we can clearly see racial and economic segregation of the city that is both historical in nature, but also very contemporary. More vulnerable populations living east of the I-35 corridor, which has been called the Eastern Crescent in Austin. And then the data that's currently coming in with regards to COVID infections are showing that certain neighborhoods in the Eastern Crescent are more vulnerable or sort of overlap or overlay with what we identify as more socially vulnerable neighborhoods. And this is really important because as we think about risks that are inherent from multiple hazards, so we're thinking about kind of the multi-hazard risk. And so can you imagine a situation where neighborhoods in Southeast Austin are currently dealing with an outbreak of infection, but then are also faced with a flood event? We can start to think about how cascading hazards create significant impacts on communities that are already socially vulnerable. So this really brings our attention to thinking about how we can address the vulnerability component, possibly by thinking about adaptive capacity. Next slide, please. And this is kind of where some really cool and interesting bright spots come through. Some of our research is showing that bonding and bridging capital have effects for community resilience that have effects in neighborhoods that are quote unquote socially vulnerable places. That there are aspects of neighborhood cohesion, there's aspects of your networks, there's aspects of having trust that have these positive effects even when the neighborhood or your social context may be more vulnerable to hazards. The capacities that cities need for resilience are pretty broad. Good infrastructure that promotes mobility, cohesive communities where neighbors can check in on each other, and good governance with multiple stakeholders. So we start to think about how these aspects of social capital, the trust, the networks, the neighborhood cohesion, maybe can put us on a different path moving forward. Next slide, please. So the current crisis provides us an opportunity to think about how we can transform institutions and systems. A shock can set us back. It's clearly the COVID pandemic has socially, economically, emotionally, physically set us back. But we can also use this pandemic not just to be persistent and return to the way things were as quickly as we can, but we can use this opportunity to transform institutions and systems in ways that are more equitable and sustainable. And I think that is the challenge, not only the challenge, but also the opportunity that's ahead of us. Next slide, please. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Carmen Pulido, the Executive Director at Go Austin, Vamos Austin. I've had the pleasure of working with GAVA over the last year or so in identifying ways that we can take some of this data and this research that we've been building out to empower neighborhoods in the city, to work with the city to change policy, and generally build resilient communities.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and thanks to all of the Planet Texas 2050 folks for getting this together. It's been awesome to listen, and I'm really happy to share. I'm Carmen Yanes Pulido, and as Patrick mentioned, I am the Executive Director for Go Austin, Vamos Austin, which is now a nonprofit organization for the last couple of years, but has been organizing as a coalition effort for the last 7 or so, beginning in Dove Springs. And I just have to say that it's moments like these that I get my fix of interdisciplinary academics by osmosis via partnerships. So it's been a pleasure to work with several of the folks who are on this call and working with Patrick's folks to develop the next framework of GAVA's evaluation, since we began as very much a childhood obesity intervention and are now organizing very explicitly around many root cause issues, which are super relevant today. So I will go to the next slide, please. So just very briefly, in case you're not familiar with GAVA, who we are and what we do, our mission is to organize and mobilize community power for health equity by reducing barriers to health while increasing institutional capacity to respond to people most impacted by historic inequities. Our vision is a future in which our neighborhood, income, race, ethnicity, primary language, and/or immigration status are not serving as primary predictors of our health outcomes. So we basically have a health equity vision that is a health equity framework, and we seek to address systemic health inequities in the following ways: by increasing access to physical activity and improved nutrition, building community power, and fostering permanency. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about what those things mean, but what I really want to point to here is just, as the previous speakers have noted,
the framework of resilience and what that really means allows us to build a further analysis on what equity is. Because really, as I've come to understand it, resilience, whether we're talking about climate resilience or community resilience, which has become a big buzzword as well. If you're familiar with the work of Dr. Wendy Ellis and her building community resilience model, she's looking at what she calls the pair of ACEs. Many of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study and looking at ACEs from an individual or familial or household level, when in reality, she pairs this with the very real systemic inequities and the systems that people interact with every day that determine many of the options in front of them when it comes to various aspects of well-being and of therefore resilience. And so I think it's really a great opportunity, as others have mentioned, to accelerate and to enhance our analysis and our action around health equity as being absolutely essential to resilience in times like these. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of a more tangible idea of the kind of stuff that GAVA does, when we're working on healthy food and physical activity, as I mentioned, we began as a childhood obesity intervention. So we were really looking at how could we increase access to healthy food and physical activity opportunities in the built environment, in schools, in early childhood centers, around parks, and within neighborhoods where we saw really high rates of childhood obesity and diabetes. And a lot of that is connecting people, but really leveraging existing relationships. I'm a community organizer by training. I cut my teeth in environmental justice organizing with Poder, where I got the opportunity to work with lots of amazing UT and St. Ed's departments, including some of y'all who are on this call today. But in terms of how we do that, we do it through networking, through our relationships, community organizing, and building leadership in the neighborhoods and across institutions. So providing training, engaging people civically, and developing those networks to address health inequities wherever they are manifesting. We have become much more explicit in the last couple of years about our work to foster permanency. And what do we mean by that when nothing is truly permanent in the Buddhist sense? And we see in front of us how anything can happen. But what we're talking about here is a level of neighborhood stability that comes with the ability to stay in place and for community to build in neighborhood networks. So we're talking about specific policies, tools, and programs that mitigate cost of living pressures. We've been working increasingly since Atlas 14 became a really pivotal point in land and water management. Conversations with the changing of the floodplain modeling data. We are looking at mitigating flood risk because Southeast Austin in particular, where we began our work, was devastated by floods in 2013 and 15. And then of course, fostering partnerships and creating coalitions to really push efforts that either mitigate displacement, not necessarily even just from a housing perspective, but from everything from a variety of policies that impact people's cost of living and also economic mobility. And that's probably one of the most exciting things right now. The opportunity in this crisis for us is doing things that would have seemed radical a month ago, like advocating for the city to dedicate $15 million in direct assistance, with half of that potentially being cash payment. And also doing things like accelerating our food distribution pilot this spring and hiring people who are out of work, leveraging our relationships with the health department, for example, to get COVID safety protocols, and work with Urban Roots Farm as a partner to get food to people right away. So things that we've been trying to work on for a long time and build pilots and innovative ways to push the institutions are suddenly much more feasible and much more necessary as we're seeing across all different sectors of society. Next slide. Thank you. So on the climate resilience and flooding issue, it's not really a surprise to many of us who are familiar with the health equity work and public health in general and community organizing, that the neighborhoods where you find a lot of disproportionate risk for chronic disease, you also see lots of climate risks and stressors. That little, that map on the side is actually from 2008 to 2016. We're talking about demolitions. This is the sort of intersection of what's happening with displacement, what's happening with climate stress, and that hotspot in Southeast Austin is from the buyouts. So you see this interesting pressure kind of coming both ways. You have a fast growing city in a hot market, and you have increasing climate risks that are all tied not only to the increasing increasing rainfall, but also to the unmitigated growth in Austin, the lack of equitable community planning for Southeast Austin, and 80 years of inequitable land and water management east and west that caused the downstream areas to suffer disproportionately in a storm. And what I want to say really quick is that this is a very deficit-based slide, and by principle, one of GAVA's principles of organizing is that we come from a strength-based place. So everybody talks about Dove Springs institutionally in a very stigmatized and deficit-based way. It flags on every SES indicator of this part of Southeast Austin. But the reality is it is one of the most cohesive, rich in terms of relationships, areas of town that I have ever worked in as a community organizer. And it's why the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation actually invested in this neighborhood when GAVA first began, and many others tagged along, was not just because there was a lot of need or there were these health disparities, but also because there were the relationships across the community and with various organizations that really created the fertile soil for these kinds of larger investments and initiatives. Next slide. Thank you. So what results are we advancing? We had already for the last year or so been organizing a Climate Navigator pilot in a peer sharing, train the trainer kind of model to anticipate, prepare, and respond for climate events, particularly flooding. And we have been organizing a lot in the way that we have organized in the past to leverage millions of dollars for park improvements or healthy food access. We've been doing a lot of that work around drainage infrastructure and tying the accessible green space work to a climate resilience lens as well. Anti-displacement and neighborhood stability efforts are really crucial. There's no way to prevent increased gentrification as you're making improvements unless you take an explicitly anti-displacement approach, we believe. We believe that inherently that has to be part of our environmental approach, and in order to involve equity, you have to be listening to the people who are most directly impacted, and they are very much impacted by both of these things in parallel and interwoven ways. The evaluation and measurement tools are super exciting because GAVA was fortunate enough to be endowed with a 5-year in-depth longitudinal evaluation with both cross-sectional and cohort studies looking at access to healthy food and physical activity and utilization of community health assets, as well as neighborhood readiness, community readiness, which is a Tri-Ethnic Institute measure of public health and community relationships and awareness that allows people to make changes, and BMI. And so we have some really great outcomes in the public health sphere, but what we really want to do is measure even more upstream, the root causes around that have to do with community cohesion, social cohesion, really all the things tied to poverty that we understand, but not just from the deficit-based place, but the strengths-based. And next slide, please. That's why we're looking at working with Patrick. And I got to give kudos to Jessica Jones, who is our amazing Connect Fellow with the RGK Center for Philanthropy and a double master's student right now in both public policy and CRP, Community Regional Planning, looking at data sets for us in climate risk. So you can see the creek flood risk in this area, as well as health risks. This is institutional data that we're using and layering it with the data that comes directly from the community, lived experience, living, working, worshiping, and living through every single rainstorm through that area. Next slide, please. And then the housing data is another piece that we're looking at. So we are taking stock of what's renter and owner occupied, in addition to what we know just from the relationships and networks. And of course, there's the Uprooted study, which has been pretty pivotal in political conversations, which is basically a literature review of other housing and displacement data and SES data in the area. from a few years ago, and we are working with those shape files to compare to the data that we're getting right now. All of that to help visualize, prioritize our work. But right now, and I don't have this slide in here because it was too big and would have made it a Google slide and a pain for the Planet Texas 2050 folks. But in the chat, I just dropped a link to an image I wanted to end with, which is that at the root of this work is really reframing this resilience concept as what we call response and responsibility. How do we respond to each other as neighbors, as community? How do we take responsibility for our own safety and the safety of those around us and those who we care about? And how do our agencies respond? How do our institutions respond in these moments? And how do they take responsibility for the legacy of inequities that we've inherited, but also the incredibly rich history of people coming together to innovate and to respond to things? That indigenous knowledge that was spoken of earlier is also, you know, that earth culture is still here. There is still so much rich knowledge in the people who are here. And if we can invest in that stability in that community, I really believe we can all advance the response to this, and also the whole storytelling and legitimizing efforts of academics to underscore that and make this closer to the world that we want to live in. And with that, I will hand it off. Sorry, I'm getting robocalled during our during our live presentation. Our next speaker, remind me, I'm so sorry.
Suzanne Pierce will be next. Thank you, Carmen.
Pierce, thank you so much.
Jenny, can you give me screen sharing access?
I will. 1 second here. Okay, you are now the host.
Oh, cool.
You should be able to screen share.
I think that's going to work. All right, great. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for staying. I see that we have run over time. There's so much information to share from all of the different groups, and building on what Carmen said about building relationship and building our ability to respond as communities. I want to think a little bit about what are the building blocks of knowledge and how do we actually construct shared knowledge together. And in order to do that, we've taken the perspective that data and models are the basic building blocks of knowledge, and they are the way that we construct and share information. In prior presentations, we spoke briefly about what the series of systems are that we've been developing in terms of a cyber infrastructure. So Planet Texas 2050 has been developing cyber ecosystem services that are capable of supporting researchers with both accessing, creating, and using those building blocks of knowledge that includes both your data and your models, as well as the, the subjective aspects of how you value what that means in your community from your perspective, both from a domain perspective as well as from a stakeholder perspective. And so we want to help people to figure out how to use those pieces of information and knowledge more efficiently and effectively. To do that, we've been prioritizing development of adaptive sensing, which allows you to get data into a shared space. That shared space is called DataX, which is a data science gateway and a portal where it's a bit like Dropbox, but for you and your team specifically, and it connects to the advanced computing services. So if you have big jobs and big computing tasks, you can actually access that compute power that can help you get to the results that you need. And then model integration, which I'll speak a bit about today, which is actually a platform that allows you to now fuse and combine those pieces of knowledge together in new ways so that you can start to build a new understanding about the meaning. And then ultimately, we've got the Digital Objects of Research, or DOLCE project, which is recognizing that as we produce these pieces of information and new knowledge, the results of this effort are of great value to this generation and future generations. And so together with the librarian information systems, we've been looking at how to build long-term archiving solutions that enable Planet Texas researchers and researchers across the board to find ways to share the large data sets that previously have been difficult to access and also difficult to store for the long term. And then finally, participatory interfaces, finding ways for us to present information to groups so that it becomes intuitive. So we take those subject matter experts out of the loop and we let the stakeholders who need to have a substantive dialogue about important issues of the day have access to that information in new ways so they can really get to the heart of what matters most to their community. Today I want to highlight some of the advances for the DataX Science Gateway and how we link that to model integration. So there's a lot to report about the other cyber ecosystem components, but today I'm just going to show a couple of quick demos to you. The DataX system has been built by many people, and we've combined prior efforts and started to develop a portal that is accessible and you can log in. From that portal, it's like Dropbox for you and your team, but it's on the UT system. It's connected directly to those compute powers. It's got some features that become relevant in terms of actually building out integrated systems and moving towards the future where we will be able to rapidly access and develop integrated analyses and data fusion products that can build new kinds of knowledge for us. And so I want to just show you quickly, I've got a long list of people who've contributed. Even more people than this have contributed to this capability. But one of the most important things that we can let you do is load your own data. So this is just a quick 1-minute video to show you when a user logs in, one of the most important things you can do is take control of your own data. So this is me logging into the portal. We can teach you how to do this and how to get on in under a half an hour. You log in, you've got access to a data workbench, and that data workbench becomes very important because we can let you access software applications, you can share data sets with your team members, you can share it more broadly with the entire Planet Texas community. And what I'm doing currently is going into the Averaging Water project. I'm loading a digital elevation model file for Travis County as an example. And I wanted to do that because of the work that Gava and Patrick Bixler have been doing specifically in the region. And so this is me loading my piece of data and information directly into the system. And here's one of the important parts. Once you get the data in, how do you get it back out? So that accessibility becomes a really important piece. So I've loaded my data, and now I'm going to take you to the next piece of this. The data is there, the data is accessible, or at least available to me. And now let's say that I've loaded data that I'm interested in using for a model. And the next piece is looking at how do I actually then integrate a model. This is the Mint model integration platform that connects to the Planet Texas DataX system. And I'm just going to quickly show you when you go into Mint, we've started building out the Texas version. So this is the live interface. You can select the region. There are other regions here, but most importantly, you can go in and you can actually start to look at data and models that are available to you that have been registered within the system by theme. When you click on any of these regions, you'll see what are the kinds of models that are available. So we've got weather models, we've got 7 hydrology models, we've got 3 agricultural models set up for this particular region. We've got data sets that are available for use. And in some cases, like the this global weather data from CHIRPS, you can actually automate a transformation of that data. The key is through the system Mint, you can quickly access and see what are the models and data that are available. In the next slides, you're going to see, I'm going to work you through a process where you actually will watch a user run a model. Whoops, and I just stopped my share, my apologies, getting back on. So let me get back to my slide deck and I'll come back over the danger of live demos, right? So all of this is possible because we've created data catalogs as well as model catalogs. And that means that we've got semantic and AI-enabled abilities to actually rapidly access and find that information. And not only that, but we've set it up in such a way that you can connect what are the physical variables of the biophysical or important physical processes, natural system processes, urban processes. How do we define that from a subject matter expertise perspective? And then also, how do we link that to the constraints that are important, the thresholds that matter to policymakers, the decision variables that we need to look at in order to test out and understand what different decisions and future scenarios may look like, and how do we set the policies in order to test out responses in these multiple systems. So this next bit, now we've got this artificial intelligence enabled platform, we've got data and models are registered and logged, and I want to just show you quickly how I actually went through and built a model in under 8 minutes and 20 seconds last night. So from DataX, I now have my file is available and I want to access it through the Mint system. I publish a URL from DataX, I grab that link, and now I'm going to switch over to the Mint platform. And you're going to see that as I switch over to Mint, I quickly register that data set. And I want to go in, and I decided that I wanted to run a flood model. Again, I picked that particular region. We can actually run these models for any place on the face of the planet at the moment using 10-meter digital elevation models. And the team with David Arctor, Paula Pasalacqua, Daniel Hardesty Lewis, David Maidman, and others are looking at how do we actually extend this so that we can use the LiDAR data sets that are available from state resources such as TNRIS. So what you see now is I am actually setting up a new flood model. And I'm telling it I want to use the hand model. I want version 2, which is a more refined and resolved model that I'm familiar with and I trust. I'm telling it what I want to call that. I'm telling it a little bit of information about who authored it. I'm telling it just some basic descriptors. I'm going to try and, I tried to make it fast. It took me 8 minutes and 20 seconds to set it up from scratch, but I wanted to, the video does take that long and I don't have that long. So let's see if I can move this forward a little bit. This is my challenge. I don't seem to have the ability to speed it up. Oh, that's a bummer. Oh, there, I found it, haha. Okay, so I'm gonna move us forward. Once I get that model registered, I select the decision variables, I set it up. Now I'm in the actual setup and runtime. I'm gonna select my model that the system now sees. And I'm going to start to actually run that model. Hopefully this will go pretty quickly. I can see the details now. If I want to understand what are the parameters that are being represented, I can start to see early visualizations and representations of what that information is. And the good thing about this is once it's registered, it's reproducible. We're now tracking the provenance of all of this information. So in 2 years, if I go back and I want to see the demo that I ran on 4/17/2020, I can come right back to this and I can find it all again and I can revisit it and I can rerun it. So now I'm about 6 minutes in from 0 in the system to preparing to run the actual model itself. It is a small model, and so I ran it. This one goes pretty fast. If you've got a larger geographic area, it takes longer. But I ran the model. And now I jumped a little bit over it because of the processing time, which was about a minute. You can actually see that I've now got an actual flood map. The blue in the center represents where the actual stream would run, and the red at the edges represents up to about 1.5 meters of a flood contour, basically. Again, this is really heavily based on hard work, many years of work by Paula Pasalacqua's group and David Arctor and David Maidman and many other people. We received help from people at University of Utah. We received help getting this set up from many folks, and it was a very incredible experience. But we now know how to set up models of any kind, so social models, analytical processes, other PDEs, models that you may have. We're ready to help you set these up inside this system because it's agnostic to what your problem is. Then what I wanted to do after I ran this model and I had this interactive map, I wanted to think about our next steps, which are going to be about getting to the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary nature of knowledge and actually starting to combine that information. So here is the result of my flood model that I ran from 0 to finished product and within just a few minutes time. And then I was thinking, well, what does that mean? And so, Carmen, I hope you don't mind. I grabbed one of your slides and one of the images, and I compared quickly the area that Carmen identified as creek and flood risk by census block. we could, if we can get this information shared now, we can overlay that on top of the actual modeled outputs. And so we can begin the process of data fusion. It's not difficult at this point because we've set up the architecture. So we can now start to layer information and knowledge on in an interactive way that we can revisit and we can compare across different approaches and different methodologies. I want to just say that it's a really exciting time. We've been looking at various ways of doing this. Another example, also in Travis County, which is heavily influenced by David Arctur's guidance on this. Daniel Hardesty Lewis ran a flood model early for Travis County, and then he overlaid building information and did a vulnerability analysis, and then compared that vulnerability analysis that he ran very quickly that's totally reusable and reproducible versus the manually constructed buyout map from the city of Austin. And we found that he got pretty good match between his map, which is on the right, and their map, which is on the left. And so we feel like it can probably accelerate our ability to construct complex analyses and combine it with information so we can generate dialogue that's based on science, data, and modeling information. And so with that, I'd like to say thanks to everybody, and hopefully I didn't take too long, and we'll be offering training courses we aspire to at least in August of 2020. And with that, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne and Adam, Patrick, and Carmen for your presentations. We now wanted to open it up to discussion. We know we're almost at 12:30, so some folks might have to get off, but we will stay on for the next 15 minutes. So again, please use the raise your hand function if you would like to speak. We also have chat on the side if you would just like to leave a comment without having, a response. And Jonathan Lowell and Allison Fiorenza will be calling out your name when it's your time to speak.
We stunned everybody into silence.
Unless that raise your hand function, I see that Patricia Nunez has her hand up.
Hello. Yes. Hi. Sorry for the intrusion earlier. So I am right now in the Boston area, Arlington, and work for Mass Audubon. We're doing a youth climate summit for youth leaders in climate justice. So I was really interested in what Carmen had to say about how we build resilience with a climate justice factor in. And I really wanted just to say thank you, because it's something that our youth is constantly getting involved in, because they can go on strikes on Friday and do a lot of things that seem like they're doing climate action, but they need that backup to connect the dots to this being also a social justice issue. So I was just wanting to say thank you so much that you really, in this talk, had a great vision of connecting history with actual data, with community, and also building that resilience. And that's what we want to build also in our climate leaders, because we have a ton of people thinking it's the Arctic, sorry about the toddler, the polar bear, or the polar bear, or something that was not social. And here's really and so with good. And so we were really just, I don't know, I just really wanted to say thank you. I just really wanted to say thank you, because I don't think that people are connecting climate justice to social justice. And this is something vital. So thank you very much. We will talk when I'm toddler less, and it's not COVID. Thank you.
And that's the real thing. So I just want to, you're very welcome, and thank you for the work that you're doing, the important work that you're doing in connecting the community dots over there. And I would say that's absolutely part of it. We're having to learn how to organize with folks who are doing exactly what you're doing, right? Or are on the front lines. And we've been getting the crash course in digital organizing, and we're all of us here, all of us out there, we're all relying on the relationships and the investment that we've put in up to this point, and it's really showing through. So thank you, keep it up, and hang in there.
John Heisenbein has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to pivot back to Suzanne's presentation. I had a question. I guess PT 2050 for our projects kind of end after a year. But I'm assuming DataX and the support, if we upload models, we have data, all of that will continue more or less in perpetuity.
Yeah, the plan right now, so DataX is actually stood up and all of the capabilities are at TAC, and we don't anticipate that they will go away. We've got current users actually in Ethiopia, believe it or not, because we've developed some of this in conjunction with folks from the Gates Foundation and some other USAID and other groups. And so we don't anticipate that it will go away. It's a new capability. It builds on top of other capabilities at TAC and complements them in ways that we're not doing things that other groups are working on. We started this week building a model catalog for epidemiological models because looking at the epidemiological models. So all of these innovations are useful across problem cases. And so I anticipate that they will be available and also that we'll maintain DataX, hopefully, I can't say in perpetuity, but for many years, research years ahead of us. And I expect that a lot of that will depend on how much people start to use the system, but this is viewed as a service that TAC can help support the research community at large with.
Yeah, absolutely, because we have another project with the Energy Institute, which is related to our Planet Texas project. And of course, we use similar data source, the hydrological models you mentioned. And so it'd be nice if we can integrate that platform and make it available to the public. And, these projects obviously will be, we hope, rolling into the future for us and other people, so.
We're in total agreement, and I hope I'm not stepping out of turn, but I think I see Wes Williams, who's from the new Institute for Disaster Resiliency for Texas too, and I'm really excited to see what that group does, and they've got years ahead of them as well. They're just kicking off, and so there should be lots of collaborative opportunities for us, and not just limited even to the UT community, but moving beyond into the future as well. So, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
I didn't want to complicate this, this David Archer. I just wanted to add something that's another layer to the flood mapping that Suzanne showed, and that's that if you have a map of the catchment boundaries, you'd see that there is a boundary right along McKinney Falls Parkway that means that water would drain toward the creek east of that parkway and away from the creek west of that parkway. And so a local neighborhood group that's concerned with development east of the parkway is concerned that it will drain into their creek, but it actually would not because of the catchment boundaries. And so there's still other data that's useful to bring in.
I was just trying to go really quickly to show that as you were talking, if I could load all of this up, we'd be able to go and look at the parkway together and talk it through. But anyway, I won't belabor that point. Yeah, it's going to take it a second to load.
Yeah.
So it looks like we might be having an issue with the raise your hand function. Maybe not. Maybe people aren't raising their hands. But we just wanted to invite you to unmute yourself and talk when you want. And it seems like that'll work just fine.
Yeah, people are being polite enough, it seems. But yeah, I'm not seeing any raised hands. Only John.
I'm rudely showing the updated map. Sorry, y'all, but it's exciting. They just changed the color scheme because we wanted a better color scheme. I guess they got that changed while I was giving the presentation. Anyway, I don't know where the parkway is, David, or else I would go there. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. It's over on the east.
Anyway, well, we can, it'll be fun.
Yeah, right along that green strip.
This green strip or? Okay, well, we can look at it later together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I can ask a question of the speakers. This is Jenny Nelson. I'm the program director for Planet Texas. And I was just reflecting on the original intention of doing this virtual conference was actually to, to hear from all of you, of course, and this is great, but I wanted to ask you all, has this current crisis made you think any differently about your work? You touched on some of that in the context of your work, but things that may be happening in the last couple of weeks, have they at all changed the way that you're approaching your own work?
I can speak to the nonprofit side of things. That's interesting to folks. I mean, and also our work with agencies and everybody. We have been, so I would say there was a space for GAVA's work in the emerging social determinants of health work and healthcare realm of an interest in closed loop referrals, for example. And for anyone who's not familiar with that term, the concept of basically tracking direct services and case management for people with, meeting basic needs. So how many people are actually receiving the services to which they're referred? Is the loop closed? And I think for a lot of the GAVA organizers, we could see where our work would be useful to that. And we were unsure of how much that was the best use of our time and our energy, because we are organizers and we're trying to build structural change as opposed to supplementing direct service or programs for folks. And now in this crisis, I am finding that we are right at the front lines of closing the loops everywhere. So providing a two-way, that like the communication channels, which is really relationship based, and then the network, and tech-wise, we're catching up and capturing that data. But really, it's just knowing who to call. It's knowing how to reach people at the community level, but also at the institutional level. And so it's definitely pushing us more into that world. And I'm certainly considering where our place is in that aspect of things. And then also, as I mentioned in my talk, just accelerating the work around investing money directly into people and getting more of the capital absorption in the system, in the financial systems of just like where our investments go and how are we paying people to solutionize in their own communities. So all of that is still like I said, it's still supporting some of the fundamental principles of our work, but certainly tactically, we're in a very different space. And that could also impact, it's impacting also how we're doing our measurement.
So if I can answer briefly, I mean, it was a sort of a hard question to think through, because up until preparing for this talk, the main way in which we've been affected was we can't do anything, right? Because our stuff is all away and in labs, and all of those avenues are closed. But one thing that it has made me think about, and specifically in trying to connect what we've been doing, which is not pandemic focused, to the current situation, it has made me think about how hard it is to stop people from moving around. So, I mean, the basic way that you deal with a plague is you say, everybody stay put. The people who are sick, go over there and don't come back until you're not sick or you're dead. And that's what they tried. I mean, I was reading some of the plague journals from Siena in the 14th century, and the Genoese landed at Pisa, and the Pisans all got sick, and the rest of the Tuscans said, no Pisans, all the Pisans have to stay away, and they all got sick anyway. I mean, so, and the Genoese ship that brought the sickness to Pisa went on to Genoa and got everybody in Genoa sick. And we're watching this issue with mobility unfold, and one of the things I was thinking about as I was listening to the other talks is, so should we be moving around less? Or should we be moving around more? Do you make communities more permanent, or do you make it easier for people to move? But if they move, what do you do with social networks? So it's made me think more about the importance of mobility. And I can add, actually, because Dev, I think, asked a question in the chat about what was missing from the environment. From my perspective, I'm really interested in trying to figure out how ancient demographic data reconstructed from isotopes and genetics can feed into models about how an epidemic might spread, for example. Because we know that there were epidemics, we know that things were happening, we know that the sources, when they start using numbers, are bonkers. So even the guy who's living it in Siena, who I quoted from, says, 80,000 people died of the 30,000 people who lived in Siena. There's a problem with that statement, right? That you can't have 80,000 people out of 30,000 people dying. It doesn't make any sense. So we don't understand the population dynamics of these plagues. And there's a big discussion that still goes on about how virulent they really are, right? What's the actual casualty rate? How many people recover? And we're just guessing. And it'd be great to be able to use models that are developed for present situations backwards onto situations where the data is thinner and there's a lot more extrapolation, but where it could really cast light on dynamics. So that's what specifically this event made me think about. Otherwise, I've been mainly thinking about how do I deal with the fact that I can't do any of the stuff that I'm supposed to be doing.
We have a couple more minutes, and Dev wrote a question that it looks like Suzanne wrote a response to, but I want to give him a chance to voice it around stakeholder perspectives and the usefulness of these tools around that. So Dev, if you want to state your question, that would be great. If he's still here.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. And I think the question really goes down to some of the stakeholders we heard, particularly the GABA one and something similar, that from their perspective, I mean, there's one thing that is happening in the modeling world where we are showing this very sophisticated data link ups, but are there things that you would like the tools to provide that are not there, and it is something that you routinely use, but you have to maybe go to 10 different places to collect that data and information to do some ongoing analysis or during some scenario case study or so forth. So if those kind of things could be listed, that what are some of the desired data set that are typically required but not necessarily available, that I think would be quite helpful for a lot of us in putting the data out there. I'll just get off from here. Thank you.
I'll just add that in the design, we thought really carefully about how to connect with people's decision problem formulation so that you could actually build your own representation of your problem. And also for the modelers and researchers and data scientists, we also have worked diligently to try to make sure that we can add your analysis into this system, and that it's so that it's agnostic to either the research approach or the problem that you want to look at. So we can help you to construct. Basically, we've tried to build the tool set you need to DIY your problem and your solution.
I wonder if, Patrick, you have perspectives on that, and or Carmen, just what are some of the tools that would be useful in working with communities that you're engaged with? Or what's missing out there, I guess, is the simple way to put the question that the cyber ecosystem could provide.
I think one of the opportunities, without knowing the specific answer to that, I just think there's an incredible opportunity to leverage networks that we've developed with community organizations to engage in a participatory process about those tools or those decision points that organizations are facing, whether those are NGOs, nonprofits, or local agencies. So I think it's super exciting to see the demonstration on the modeling platform and really draw a link on how the work that we've been doing can directly plug right into that. It was really great.
Yeah, I think it's just exciting to see the visuals side by side. And I think as we're able to integrate more things and have a visual to use with people, we've been working toward that collectively, I know, for some time. And we envisioned it as house meetings and community meetings and mapping exercises and everything. And so now, as we're just adapting all of our stuff digitally, it's probably going to be smaller, more intimate groups, stuff families can do, come together in different ways, but we still have every intention of just using the visuals. And then we've talked about various platforms. Some of our National Science Foundation collaborative efforts, for example, looking for funding to develop more flexible platforms that protect people's personal data, but allow them to activate it and engage live geocoded data points and integrate that as well. So all that's kind of crystallizing in a new reality, I would say.
I'll just add, in my prior work, I would go down to the Atacama Desert and work with original peoples communities there, and I would take the touchscreen with me and work with much simpler platforms and much simpler data sets, and to see the empowerment that happens when you literally level the playing field. So if you walk into a room and add a touch screen that's a large touch screen panel to a group of 4 to 5 people, watching them interact with information and recognize that they are capable of sitting at the table as equals with any of the other stakeholder groups that they need to interact with for planning purposes. It's one of the most incredible things I've seen. And then testing this, we've been working diligently with a group from World Modelers, which is a DARPA-funded program. And so we've stress tested these systems already with stakeholders out of Ethiopia that came through, and we do 5-day planning what do they call it? They call it charrettes, I think. Is that right? I need Catherine to correct me. But yeah, so we go through and we like flex test the system and see if somebody can go from 0 to a full recommendation to a decision maker for a really complex problem. In their case, they're looking at humanitarian aid decisions. And they do it. They do it really effectively. So I'm so excited to test this out in Texas with people that need to use advanced tools or can benefit from them, and what we'll learn from that process. Woohoo!
All right. That seems like a good note on which to conclude. It's now a little bit after 12:45, so we are going to wrap it up. And I just wanted to thank Suzanne, Adam, Carmen, and Patrick for your presentations, and the Planet Texas team that helped bring this together, and all of you who attended today and asked questions. So yeah, you can do jazz hands, you can use the reaction buttons, or we'll have the comments or the chat open for another minute. So thanks, everybody.